So before I read the lawsuit that was filed this week by the Unitarian Universalist Association and the 26 other faith groups, before I read that lawsuit filed against Homeland Security and other agencies and their directors, I was going to preach this really straightforward sermon about the allyship between Unitarian Transcendentalists and Black abolitionists of the 19th century. I've been thinking about this sermon for a while, but I was waiting until February, as it is Black History Month this month. So I was, composing along for days, and then after the lawsuit came out, I started thinking I should preach on the lawsuit. But then I started thinking, these are all connected. They're cut from the same cloth. Progressive transcendentalist thought, abolitionism, and the lawsuit demanding that our government keep our schools and churches and other religious places safe. The immigrants, our neighbors, be treated as human beings with all the inherent rights that entails, and their dignity, is a third American Revolution. This one, I hope, my fervent hope, is that it can be accomplished without violence and gunfire. But there is an ache in my heart that feels so similar. The phrase, the Second American Revolution, is going to come up several times today, and it already has. So when you hear it, think about what was happening in the 1800s and how that kind of parallels with what we're doing today. But today we're focusing on issues of immigration that were with the abolitionists even before the Civil War, but unfortunately is terribly left out of history. It's not a perfect comparison, but there are important commonalities that we can apply to today. And this sermon is a little intellectual. There's a lot to take in. There's a lot of names. And I want to say that I relied heavily on the work of John Behrens, Barry Andrews, who happens to live very close to where I live in Washington, and Cynthia Grant Tucker, who are all UU historians. So John Behrens, in his book about the Transcendentalists, this is how he introduces you to his book and to who the Boston Unitarian Transcendentalist is. Okay, just woof. Transcendentalists of the 1800s. And this is from his book about conflagration. And he is hoping that you hear the message in today's terms. He says that very specifically. Many of us first meet the Transcendentalists in literature classes in high school or college. This gives the impression we should think of them primarily as writers. Many Transcendentalists and their followers were also fervent activists, sparking the intellectual, spiritual, moral, and political struggle in America for racial, gender, social, and environmental justice that continues to this day. They were also far more religious than people realize. Transcendentalism required seeing and treating others, including children, the poor, women, the enslaved, not as objects, but as subjects, as moral agents whose spiritual and moral potential was to be given opportunity and to be encouraged. Their ethical stance gave rise to nothing less than the start of the Second American Revolution, demanding to end slavery, greater equality for women, and greater social opportunity for all. May this narrative help each of its readers find some story, some forebearer, some suggestion as to how to become more self-transcendent in these difficult times, to make a difference to those who follow us. End of quote. So the teeny tiny history lesson, the Transcendentalists were almost exclusively Unitarians. And I don't want to overwhelm you with a long list of names, but you would recognize the vast majority of them. Some of these will be familiar to you. William Ellery Channing may not be, but he was the most influential minister in establishing a liberal theology in American Unitarianism. He is the great-great-grandfather of what we do today as Unitarians. There was also Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Nathaniel Hawthorne, the Alcotts. And it was Boston that was the center of Transcendentalist activism. So Transcendentalism really started in that Boston area and in Massachusetts and kind of moved to other places from there. Margaret Fuller, Elizabeth Peabody were for women's rights as well as many other things. Horace Mann, who brought us free public education, especially for the poor. Julia Ward Howe, who wrote John Brown's Body and rewrote it as the Battle Hymn of the Republic for the Civil War. Transcendentalists were also among the first religious Americans to embrace Darwin's On Origin of the Species, partly because it rejected racialism, but also it used a scientific argument to support this idea of human kinship, that we all have everything in common. Among Transcendentalists, women held stations that were rarely heard of at the time. They preached in pulpits, they edited newspapers, they ran businesses, they drafted testimony that was read in the legislature, although it had to be read by men. Horace Mann was one of those good men who would read these texts, giving full credit to their female author. So while Transcendentalists had differences of opinion, a lot, they spoke and wrote often about the immorality and the cruelty of enslavement, the unfairness and immorality of keeping women from the vote and from other power positions in society. They felt women were every bit as capable as men. And also they spoke about the negative impact of class as it exploited the poor. They did so because there are several core tenets of Transcendentalism, and I'm not really going to talk about the spiritual side of that, but they didn't believe God was way out there. They believed God lived completely within. And if God lives within, you need to live out that love of God. You need to show it in your works, in your actions. So the two tenets that are relational to this morning's sermon is they, at their core, had a mutual concern for the welfare of all other human beings. And secondly, the conviction that it's only by helping others to be able to fulfill their moral and spiritual and creative potential. So only by creating situations in which others could do that could a Transcendentalist realize their own. So I centered my story this morning around the time that the United States Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Law, and President Millard Fillmore signed it into effect on September 18th, 1850. Millard Fillmore was actually a Unitarian, and he didn't support slavery, but he wasn't sure really how to get rid of it, and he was afraid of the too much, what would happen with too much stress and strain. And the Fugitive Slave Law meant that enslaved people who had escaped into non-slave states were now much more vulnerable for being returned. The new law created criminal penalties for anyone who helped them escape and required citizens to assist in the capture. Those identified as fugitives could not testify on their own behalf, nor could they have a jury trial. So when Fillmore signed the Fugitive Slave Act into law, many of Boston's commercial leaders, called the Cotton Whigs, because remember we had Democrats and we had Whigs, so it was the Cotton, and the Democrats of then are not anything like the Democrats of today. It's like we've switched. So the Cotton Whigs, they were happy, they were relieved, because they wanted the cotton trade to go uninterrupted, because cotton is grown in the South, but it's processed and made into cloth in the North. However, the conscience branch of the Whig Party was deeply disturbed. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote, "This filthy enactment was made in the 19th century by people who could read and write, by which he means educated, I will not obey it by God. So we had the Fugitive Slave Act as our setting, and now I want to introduce one of the first players, Lewis Hayden. He was an African-American man and a leader of Black Boston, and perhaps the most effective activist and abolitionist. He is often left out of the history books. We will see Frederick Douglass's name, but we don't often see the name of Lewis Hayden. Lewis Hayden had been born into slavery in Kentucky in 1812. As he grew, he took a wife and they had a child, but his wife and child were taken into the deep cotton lands of the South, and he never saw them again. So he escaped with the help of a white man. So he went north into Boston, and he arrived in 1845, so before the Fugitive Slave Law, so he could move about Boston and feel reasonably safe. He quickly became part of the anti-slavery movement. And again, in our history books, the anti-slavery movement was far more Black-led and interracial than most history books talk about. Hayden became friends with John Andrew, a young lawyer, white lawyer, but who was very influential at the time. And despite their differences in theology, race, age, and certainly life experience and education, they became very close friends through their abolitionist work. Hayden also opened a store on Boston's Cambridge Street, and he advertised in the newspaper. It said, "Men and boys clothing at low prices." And it turned out that was code for, if you are a fugitive from the South, come in and you'll be furnished with warm clothing so that you can get through the New England winter. Hayden eventually took a second wife, Harriet. They ran a boarding house. They provided shelter, food, and clothing to fugitive slaves. And after the Fugitive Slave Law, they became a stop on the Underground Railroad because that all had to be done covertly. They helped over 100 people escape. Hayden also worked closely with Robert Morris, who was the first Black lawyer in Boston. And the Transcendentalists do not take credit for Robert Morris's success or his commitment or his intellect, but they did help open doors for him and they did help finance his education. So now I'm going to flip over to Theodore Parker, and I have preached about Theodore Parker before. He's the one with the gun in one hand and the sword in the other because his home was a stop on the Underground Railroad, and that's how he would write his sermons. But he's my favorite Unitarian. So he shows up in many of my sermons. So in the 1840s, he wrote passages later taken over by others, such as government by the people, government of the people, by the people, and for the people, which of course was later adapted by Abraham Lincoln. He also wrote, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice, which is taken up by, of course, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., over 100 years later, but those belonged to Parker. He had a huge falling out with the Cotton Whigs of Boston. He was truly hated over his refusal to obey the Fugitive Slave Law, and he was fiery in the pulpits and meetings, encouraging all Unitarians to do the same. He was also, as I did some reading about him lately, I see glimmers in Parker of starting to support humanist thought. And I found a great quote from him, which I can't do in its entirety, but what he was asking is that people love God or the ground of shared experiences and our neighbors as ourselves. Because again, he felt actions were more important. He was also quite interested in interfaith around the world. Many of the Transcendentalists were grandchildren of leaders of the American Revolution, and they carried that with great pride. And so Parker writes this scathing letter to President Fillmore for signing the Fugitive Slave Law. And he says, suppose I had taken a person to my house and sheltered them as the storm passed by. Should you think I did a thing worthy of a fine or imprisonment? There hangs in my study the gun of my grandfather fought with at the Battle of Lexington, and a musket captured from a British soldier that same day. If I would not peril my property, my liberty, nay, my life, to keep my parishioners out of slavery, then I should throw away these trophies and be thought of as some coward, not a brave man's child. He was so forceful. He alienated lots of Unitarian clergy. They were afraid to have him in their pulpits, because if they had Cotton Whig members and Cotton Whig members left, and the financial impact, the impact on status. But Parker knew there was a higher calling. Most transcendental ministers were really peace-loving people, and yet they gradually came to realize, through all the anti-slavery movement education going on in Boston, that it was starting to become a marital imperative that they oppose slavery openly, and that it was going to require sacrifice, and that it might require a second American Revolution. So Parker and Lewis Hayden, the escaped slave, they did much organizing together, they did much speaking together, and they brought in ever-increasing numbers. Frederick Douglass came to speak at one of their forums. Parker started advocating, let's form the same kind of committees that were evoked just before the Revolutionary War, because these committees were effective. And one of the committees, I just tell this part because I think it's tragic and fun both at the same time. One of them that they formed was the Vigilance Committee, who began to harass slave hunters who have come to Boston. Abolitionist lawyers filed suits against them for which they would have to post a bond. And if they couldn't post a bond, they were in jail and they couldn't be hunting for enslaved people who had escaped. Parker went to confront slave hunters at their hotel. They used nonviolence. However, they did engage in jailbreaks of those awaiting trial or deportation. Interestingly enough, they never got arrested for it somehow, but and slowly over time, the free people in Boston really started to get disgusted with the slave hunters coming into their town, and they became more and more unsupportive of the fugitive slave law. So the tide began to turn because of all this work. As an aside, they also became very involved in keeping Kansas a slave-free state. They did this by a lot of them relocating into Kansas where they could be a physical presence. They also gave money to the effort, some of which got sidelined into purchasing arms. And Transcendentalist Thomas Starr King went to California, where he worked tirelessly to keep California from becoming a slave state. He is actually credited for being the largest single-handed influence, and he was a Transcendentalist Unitarian. 6 of the Transcendentalists, including Theodore Parker, started backing the effort of the white abolitionist John Brown, who of course used explosions and other violence. Julia Ward Howe wrote the hymn about John Brown's body after he was executed. After Brown's death, John Behrens describes, Emerson and Thoreau helped bring John Brown, the Christ-like martyr, into being a Christ-like martyr whose death might make the Civil War redemptive if it resulted in ending slavery. And when the Civil War finally came, I did not know this, Transcendentalists led the greatest humanitarian relief effort so far in their history. I am wrapping up. I know I'm going long-winded this morning. Parker and Frederick Douglass, and of course Hayden, all had a friendship. And Theodore Parker died in Europe before the end of the Civil War. And in 1887, Frederick Douglass went to see Parker's gravestone and found it to be this little plain brown gravestone. And he said, this is not reflective of what Parker, the influence Parker has had. And so Douglas worked with Unitarians and a noted sculptor writing these words for Parker's new gravestone. It says, "The great American preacher, his name is engraved in marble, his virtues in the hearts of those he helped free from slavery and superstition." So I am going to wrap it up, and I know I'm being long-winded. I told you these stories this morning to give us hope about our current situation. We are in a third American Revolution right now, and it's the fight for democracy. I also want to strongly emphasize, especially for any of you out on YouTube who can't talk to me after the service, I am not encouraging us to take up arms or engage or support violence. I am only encouraging nonviolent, but no less impassioned resistance, that we voice our disagreement when we see injustice. The Unitarian Transcendentalists stayed true to a vision that everyone has a fundamental right to self-determination, and that our actions have to come out of love at the center and care and compassion. This week, I am particularly focused on our friends and neighbors at Bienvenidos, the staff, the volunteers, the families they serve, because they need our support right now. Immigrants in our wider community need help. Bienvenidos has sent us an information sheet on actions we can take. There are some small ones, there are some medium ones, there are some larger ones. So if any of you are interested in that, it's on one of these round tables over here. There's the flyer. There are also two cards for you to sign for their staff. I will close with our opening words that Rachel found that I think are just so brilliant. They underline the importance of working in collaboration and mutual respect. If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up in mine, then let us work together. Amen.